Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a grim chapter of history, the Black Plague. Imagine this. It's the 14th century, and you're living in a world where death is lurking in every corner. Cities are crowded, streets are filthy, and people have no idea what's coming. The air smells like decay, and the slightest touch from a sick person could seal your fate. You probably won't survive this. That's a harsh reality check, right? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is over there. Drop your location and local time in the comments below. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Black Plague, a name that echoes through history like a death knell. It's one of those events that no matter how much time passes remains a symbol of suffering, fear, and chaos. In the mid-14th century, a bacterial disease carried by fleas and spread by rats turned Europe into a battlefield. It didn't just kill people. It decimated entire communities, leaving behind a trail of destruction that would be felt for centuries to come. The term Black Death probably makes you picture a mysterious grim shadow creeping over the land. But back then, people didn't have the luxury of understanding what was happening to them. Imagine waking up in the morning feeling a little off. Maybe you've got a headache. Maybe your stomach's a bit unsettled. But before you know it, that mild discomfort has turned into a full-on assault on your body. Fever chills, painful swellings, buboes. That's the hallmark of this disease. If you were unlucky enough to contract the Black Plague, your chances of survival were slim to none. In those days, survival wasn't just about escaping illness. It was about navigating a landscape filled with fear, misinformation, and desperation. The idea of death hanging over you at every moment wasn't something people were used to. Sure, diseases existed, but nothing on this scale. The plague didn't just strike down a few people here and there. It wiped out entire villages in a matter of weeks. When you're living in a world where death is as commonplace as breathing, it makes you wonder, how did anyone survive this horror? And yet, despite the overwhelming odds, some did survive. But what was survival like? Was it a blessing or was it a curse? Imagine losing everyone you knew. Your family, your friends, maybe even your entire community. The people you'd spent your whole life with are suddenly gone, and you're left to navigate a broken world. In some ways, surviving the Black Plague wasn't the victory people might think. It was a sentence to a world that had changed irrevocably. You've probably heard about the symptoms of the Black Plague. The fever, the chills, the massive grotesque swellings that appeared on the body, and most notoriously, the buboes. But let's pause for a moment and really think about it. Picture yourself waking up one day, feeling unusually cold despite the warmth of the sun outside. Then, out of nowhere, a fever strikes, and soon enough you feel this intense, aching pressure around your armpits or groin. It's like something is trying to burst out from beneath your skin. You're probably too weak to stand, but the pain is overwhelming. The buboes have appeared. These buboes were swollen lymph nodes about the size of a fist, and they became one of the defining signs of the plague. You might think, okay, That sounds unpleasant. But the reality was far worse. The skin over the buboes would often become purple or blackened, hence the name Black Death. And let's not forget the smell. The odor of decaying flesh was enough to make anyone gag. Doctors at the time didn't have the faintest clue what was causing the plague, so they tried every remedy they could think of, none of which worked. And many times, the person who had the buboes wouldn't make it past the next 24 hours. Now, here's something even stranger. Scientists still argue whether the plague was solely caused by the bacteria Yersinia pestis, which is the most likely candidate, or if other factors like environmental conditions and stress may have played a part. Either way, that bacteria was a silent killer hiding in fleas that would latch onto rats and then latch onto humans. Fleas themselves weren't the direct problem. They were just the carriers. The real villain was the bacterium inside them. But those who weren't infected with the bubonic form of the plague didn't exactly get off easy either. There were other forms of the plague, septicemic and pneumonic, that were just as terrifying. If the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, it could cause septicemia, where your blood would effectively poison you from within, turning your skin dark and mottled in just a few hours. If it infected the lungs, you might be coughing up blood before you even knew what was happening to you, and soon the disease would spread through the air, infecting others who breathed the same air. This is where the horror of the Black Plague really sets in. It wasn't just the physical symptoms. It was the sheer unpredictability and speed of death. You could be perfectly fine in the morning, and by nightfall, you could be fighting for your life, or worse, already gone. So imagine living in that reality. It's not just about trying to stay alive. It's about facing a disease that makes no sense and having no idea if you'd be the next one struck down. And with so many people around you falling ill and dying, it's easy to see why people began to panic. Let's take a moment to step into one of those plague-ridden cities. Picture yourself living in a town, maybe a small one, maybe larger, like London or Florence, and it's bustling. People go about their daily routines, working, talking, socializing, maybe even complaining about how cramped and dirty things are. But then whispers start to spread. A sickness has begun to take hold. At first, it's just a few cases and people brush it off. Maybe it's some sort of fever that'll pass. But then it doesn't. People start dropping like flies, and soon enough, the streets are filled with the stench of death. In a time when sanitation was non-existent, and the streets were little more than open sewers, the plague spread like wildfire. You probably didn't need to be a scientist to figure out that filth and disease were somehow connected. But that's about all the understanding people had. Public health wasn't exactly a top priority, and the very things that made life in the city uncomfortable, overcrowding, poor hygiene, garbage piling up in the streets, were also the things that facilitated the plague's rapid spread. What you would notice immediately is the sense of dread hanging in the air. It's not like modern-day pandemics, where we have access to information, doctors, and treatments, or at least we think we do. Back then, if you saw someone walking with a fever, or the telltale blackened buboes, you didn't know whether they were about to die or if they had some sort of rare but treatable condition. So there was no real way to protect yourself. You'd probably try to avoid contact with the sick, but that didn't always work. And as for the authorities, well, they were struggling to keep up. The reactions to the plague varied. Some cities, like Venice, were among the first to implement quarantine measures. They set up isolation zones where ships arriving from affected areas were kept for up to 40 days, hence the term quarantine from the Italian word quaranta, meaning 40. But that didn't necessarily stop the disease from spreading. The truth was, it wasn't just ships that carried the plague. The fleas and rats that lived on the ships carried it inland too. So, even though quarantine helped, in some cases, it didn't provide a magical barrier. Other cities weren't quite as fortunate. Imagine being forced to abandon family members who were struck with the disease simply because there were no resources to care for them. It wasn't uncommon for people to leave their loved ones to die alone, especially when the disease was too much of a threat to risk exposure. Families were torn apart, with people either too scared or too exhausted to help, and the sick either dying alone or being left to fend for themselves. In these infected cities, things were chaotic. With the death toll rising by the day, people were scrambling to find safety. Some fled to the countryside, thinking they might escape the disease in the rural areas, while others tried to hide in their homes, hoping to avoid the inevitable. But it wasn't as simple as packing up and leaving. Cities were tight-knit, and the roads were often impassable, not to mention that most people were too poor to travel far. So, in essence, there was nowhere to run, no safe place to go. Meanwhile, bodies piled up. Mortuaries couldn't keep up with the sheer volume of corpses, and burial sites quickly became overcrowded. In some cities, mass graves were dug, and people were buried quickly in large pits, often with no ceremony. The process was mechanical, not mournful, simply a way to keep up with the relentless tide of death. This wasn't just a physical decay of the body, it was the decay of society itself, and for many, it felt like the world was falling apart. At the same time, however, the city wasn't entirely in disarray. Some survivors, those who were lucky enough to escape the disease, did what they could to help. They tended to the sick, offered shelter to the homeless, and tried to restore some sense of normalcy amidst the chaos. But what could they really do? After all, this wasn't a war that could be fought with bravery or brawn. There was no enemy to fight off, no defense against the invisible threat that hovered like a dark cloud over every household. It was the kind of terror that lingered day in and day out until it was hard to tell where the disease stopped and the fear began. Now scientists still debate whether the rapid spread of the plague was mostly due to human behavior, or if other environmental factors, like a particularly harsh climate, contributed. In any case, the spread wasn't just about disease. It was about the perfect storm of overcrowding, poor sanitation, and the absence of modern medical knowledge. It was a lethal combination that set the stage for disaster. As the Black Plague's devastation continued to unfold, authorities, or what passed for them in those chaotic times, tried desperately to regain some sense of control. One of the first responses to the deadly outbreak was the establishment of quarantine measures. Now imagine this. You're living in a medieval city, and suddenly the word spreads that a quarantine is being enforced. This doesn't mean your local hospital, because, let's be real, there are no hospitals as we know them today. Instead, quarantine took on a much grimmer meaning. It was the isolation of the sick, and the living from one another. Quarantine itself, though an essential public health measure in modern times, was born out of this terrifying period. The word quarantine comes from the Italian quarante, meaning 40, specifically 40 days. In Venice, authorities mandated that incoming ships be detained for 40 days before allowing anyone to disembark in an attempt to limit the spread of the disease. It wasn't exactly the most humane or effective solution, but at the time, it was the best they could come up with. The idea behind quarantine was simple. If the disease was spread by people or goods, keeping infected individuals or cargo isolated for a period of time might stop it from reaching others. In reality, though, it wasn't foolproof. The Black Plague didn't just follow the neat paths of trade and travel. Fleas that carried the disease didn't need boats or roads to travel. They were excellent hitchhikers, living on the backs of rats who, let's face it, didn't care much for quarantine. But people didn't really have a better option. So picture yourself living during this time. You hear rumors of quarantine measures being enforced, and suddenly you're faced with a tough decision. If someone in your family is sick, do you leave them behind and risk losing them forever? Or do you stay by their side and risk becoming infected yourself? In some cases, families were forced to abandon loved ones. This wasn't because they didn't care, it was sheer desperation. The plague was unforgiving, and if you were exposed, the odds were not in your favor. You might have tried to hide away in your house, shutting the doors, and hoping that the disease would pass you by. But eventually, someone would come knocking, looking for help, or worse, just to take away another body for burial. If you were one of the unlucky ones who caught the disease, your fate was sealed. Quarantine didn't mean care. It meant you were on your own, whether you were left to recover or to die in isolation. Sometimes, those who had been infected were taken to special quarantine sites outside the city, where they could die without infecting others. Picture this, a place where the sick were left in peace, away from the bustle of daily life. It was a grim solution, but one that helped prevent further outbreaks. In a sense, those placed in quarantine were left in a limbo state, not quite dead, but certainly not alive in the sense you might think. Now imagine what it was like for the healthy. You're not sick yet, but with every passing day, you know you might be next. You can't escape the growing number of empty houses, the streets filled with people in mourning, or the carts that come through the neighborhood collecting bodies. People had to face the harsh reality that even the healthiest among them could be struck down at any moment. And then there was the fear of being branded as contagious, even if you hadn't yet shown symptoms. The social stigma that arose from being in quarantine was immense. Those who were marked for quarantine were often seen as outcasts, even by their own communities. Here's where things get really weird. People started to panic. When faced with a threat that no one understood and could do nothing to control, fear took over. People began turning to supernatural explanations for the disease. What if God was punishing them for their sins? What if the plague was some sort of divine retribution? Or even more bizarrely, what if the air itself had become corrupted, causing disease to spread more easily? The idea of bad air was actually a common theory at the time, and it led to the widespread use of protective measures like carrying around herbs or flowers to ward off the noxious miasma believed to be causing the illness. Some people even carried posies of flowers, hoping the sweet scent would keep them safe. But quarantine wasn't just about the sick. It became a kind of societal divide, a way to separate those who might still be healthy from those who had already been infected. If you were a healthy individual, there were all sorts of weird and strange protocols to follow. Some were more superstitious than others, burning incense, wearing strange outfits designed to ward off the plague. Those beak-shaped masks with long noses weren't for fashion, they were for protection and avoiding crowds as much as possible. Others tried to rely on more practical measures, like sealing up their homes, making sure no rats could enter, and burning their clothes. Despite all the efforts, quarantine didn't really work in the way people hoped. Yes, it slowed the spread of the disease in some areas, but in others, it just added to the terror. Cities that were well-established trade hubs became some of the hardest hit. Ports became points of entry for both goods and the deadly bacteria, and even quarantine couldn't stop the flow of commerce or death. The more people tried to isolate the sick, the more the disease found ways to slip through the cracks, whether it was via unwashed clothing, contaminated food, or just simple bad luck. And here's where it gets even murkier. While quarantine is now a cornerstone of public health efforts, especially in managing pandemics, back then, it was more of a desperate shot in the dark. There was no real understanding of how diseases spread, no germs, no bacteria, no vaccines to fall back on. They were stuck trying whatever they could to stop the tide, but most of the time, it was too little too late. Quarantine was in some ways an experiment in survival. It showed both the best and worst of humanity, people coming together to help each other, and then, in the same breath, abandoning loved ones out of fear. It was a practice born out of necessity, but it also highlighted just how little people knew about disease transmission at the time. Ironically, it was an effort that helped pave the way for more sophisticated public health measures. Centuries later, though at the time, it seemed like a feeble, temporary fix. As the Black Plague continued to ravage Europe, people began searching for answers in places where they could find none. When you're living in a world where the very nature of existence feels threatened, it's easy to turn to things you can control, or at least believe you can control. And that's exactly what happened. People desperate for a reason turned to superstition, religion, and sometimes outright absurdity to make sense of the chaos. Imagine yourself in the middle of this confusion, watching your neighbors and loved ones fall ill, knowing there's no doctor who can offer a cure, no science to explain the horror that's unfolding around you. You might find yourself wondering, why me? Why my family? What did we do wrong? When the Black Plague struck, there wasn't much the average person could do, except rely on whatever explanation seemed most reasonable in the absence of knowledge. Religion, of course, played a massive role. People turned to God, praying for mercy, hoping that their faith might save them. The idea that the plague was divine punishment for the sins of humanity gained traction. Priests and clergy claimed that God was punishing the wicked, and that only repentance and penance could avert further catastrophe. In some ways, the plague brought people closer to religion as communities gathered in churches to pray for protection. But at the same time, it also led to a breakdown in trust. You could pray all you wanted, but that didn't seem to stop the fever from taking over. After all, prayers didn't stop your neighbor's house from being marked with a chalk X, signaling that someone inside had died. But for some, the religious fervor wasn't enough. Some people took matters into their own hands in increasingly extreme ways. Enter the flagellants groups of men, and sometimes women, who in their desperation began publicly whipping themselves in an attempt to atone for their sins. They believed that by inflicting pain upon themselves, they could appease God and prevent the spread of the plague. Picture the scene: men walking through the streets, naked and bloodied, chanting prayers, hoping that their self-inflicted suffering might end the plague. It's the kind of ritualistic practice that seems both bizarre and deeply tragic, yet for many, it felt like their only hope in a hopeless world. At the same time, there were others who embraced even darker beliefs. Some saw the plague as an opportunity to cast blame. There were whispers that the disease had been sent by witches or caused by an evil supernatural force. In some cases, entire communities turned on specific groups, like Jews, accusing them of poisoning the wells or practicing dark magic. Jews were often scapegoated, blamed for the disease, because they were less affected, largely due to their different hygiene practices and customs. This led to widespread pogroms, or violent outbreaks against Jewish communities, resulting in massacres and expulsions. It was a time when fear and ignorance combined to create horrific acts of violence, all in the name of survival. And of course, there were other more bizarre attempts to prevent the plague. People were told to carry protective items, amulets, charms, or even pieces of clothing that had been blessed by religious figures. Some believed that burning certain herbs or carrying flowers, such as roses, would ward off the disease. Others made attempts at creating potions or concoctions out of strange ingredients like arsenic or crushed jewels, hoping they could heal the sick or prevent infection. None of these methods worked, of course, but they provided a sense of control in a world that seemed out of control. But there was one thing that most people had in common: fear. No matter where you turned, the threat of death was all around you. Even the richest and most powerful were not immune to the disease. Kings, queens, bishops, no one was safe. It didn't matter how wealthy you were or what your status in society was. If the plague came for you, it came for you. For many, this was an uncomfortable reminder that there were forces far greater than any king or bishop, forces they could not see, touch, or understand. However, in the midst of all this turmoil, there was still a sense of collective action. People began to come together often in desperate and sometimes misguided ways to try to fight the disease. Public health measures like cleaning the streets, isolating the sick, and sometimes even burning contaminated clothing became common. But it wasn't just fear that motivated people. It was the knowledge that if everyone pitched in, the disease might be stopped. It wasn't much, but it was something. It's strange to think about how even in a time when medicine was nearly non-existent, people were still trying to make sense of it all. They may not have understood what the plague was, but they understood the need to survive. And in those dark times, survival often meant clinging to the beliefs that offered comfort, even if those beliefs were born out of fear and misunderstanding. Now, looking back, it's easy to scoff at the superstitions, the bizarre rituals, and the fear-fueled scapegoating. But during the Black Plague, these actions weren't just attempts at explanation, they were lifelines. In a world where death could strike at any moment, people needed to believe that they could do something to escape it, even if that something seemed utterly irrational. Because the alternative, sitting helplessly in the face of an invisible and unstoppable killer, was too terrifying to bear. The thing about surviving the Black Plague is that it wasn't just about dodging the disease itself. It wasn't like you could simply wake up one morning, shrug off the fever, and go back to your usual life. No, surviving the plague meant facing a new grim reality, a world where the rules of life had fundamentally changed. If you managed to survive the plague, you found yourself in the aftermath, dealing with not only the physical scars, but the emotional and psychological toll that came with living through such a catastrophic event. Imagine you're one of the lucky few who somehow make it through the plague. You're alive, but everything around you has fallen apart. Your family, your friends, gone. And the world you once knew is crumbling. Cities are eerily quiet, with streets abandoned, homes empty, and businesses closed for good. Imagine wandering through a city that's mostly silent, aside from the occasional sound of a cart being wheeled down the road to collect more bodies. It's hard to comprehend the isolation that must have washed over survivors. There's a strange kind of grief that comes with outliving your entire world. Your entire social fabric has been torn apart, and it's not just the loss of loved ones, it's the loss of community, of shared experiences, of everything that defined normalcy. Surviving the Black Plague didn't mean you were free of its grip. Even after the fever broke, many survivors were left with lingering symptoms: fatigue, weakness, even permanent disabilities like skin lesions or loss of mobility due to damage to the joints. The psychological scars were even more profound. Surviving didn't erase the haunting memories of what you had witnessed, the shrieks of the dying, the stench of rotting corpses in the streets, the feeling of helplessness as friends and family succumbed. Imagine for a second trying to sleep at night. Your mind replays the images of those you lost over and over. It's not just survivor's guilt. It's a haunting sense that you've come through the worst of it, but nothing will ever be the same again. And if you think it ends there, it doesn't. After the initial shock of the plague, survivors found themselves in a strange limbo. Most people who lived through it still had to make sense of what had happened, if they could at all. How do you return to a normal life after everything you knew was wiped away? The aftermath was bleak. Those who survived found themselves in a world that was fundamentally altered. With so many people dead, the population was dramatically reduced and entire communities were wiped out. The labor force was decimated, and those left behind had to navigate the overwhelming loss of resources. In cities, food was scarce. What had once been a bustling trade center was now a shell of its former self, filled with empty shops and abandoned homes. There was also a great deal of social unrest. People who had once lived side by side were now mistrustful of one another, afraid that the disease would return at any moment. Fear was contagious, and it didn't stop with the plague. This was the world that survivors inherited. In many ways, surviving the Black Plague didn't just mean living through the disease, it meant rebuilding a world that had been shattered. But it wasn't an easy task. With so many deaths, there were simply fewer people left to take care of the land, tend to crops, or work in businesses. The economy took a long time to recover, as labor shortages hit agricultural production and manufacturing. Wages began to rise, but so did inflation, as the price of goods skyrocketed due to the scarcity of workers and resources. In some ways, survivors could find a sense of hope in this new world. With fewer people around, laborers gained more bargaining power. This led to shifts in power, with peasants and workers demanding higher wages and better living conditions. The plague had, in a way, set the stage for social mobility. However, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. Survivors faced suspicion from the population. Those who had outlived the plague were often treated with a certain amount of distrust. People whispered that survivors were somehow tainted. Perhaps they had been spared because they had been infected, or perhaps they had somehow lucked out when others didn't. Survivors' guilt was real, but so was a societal reluctance to fully accept those who had lived through such a traumatic event. And there were those who saw the survivors as a resource, those who could rebuild what had been lost. But who could be trusted in a world so full of pain and uncertainty? Survivors had to learn to cope with a reality where everyone else seemed to be mourning what was lost, while they themselves were haunted by the ghosts of the past. To some, it felt as if the plague had left nothing untouched, not just the physical body, but the very soul of the community. But amidst all of this, there was also a strange sense of resilience. People began to rebuild. New social structures started to emerge. Even though the first few years after the plague were difficult, the survivors began to forge ahead, carving out new paths for themselves in a shattered world. The labor force was restructured. Cities slowly began to repopulate, and slowly the community began to grow back from the ruins. However, it wasn't a quick fix. Reconstruction took time, and it came with its own set of challenges. It wasn't just the loss of family and community that weighed on survivors. It was the very idea that they had lived through something so awful, and yet were still here. How could anyone move forward after witnessing such an unprecedented disaster? Surviving the plague was not a simple victory. It was a curse in its own right. It forced you to reconsider everything you thought you knew about life, about death, and about the world itself. You might have walked away physically unharmed, but your heart and mind were scarred perhaps forever. It wasn't a matter of being thankful that you had survived. It was a matter of surviving something that in many ways left you as hollow and fragile as the world you once knew. When we look back at the aftermath of the Black Plague, it's easy to get caught up in the vast destruction, the decimated populations, the shattered social systems, the mourning that seemed to consume every corner of Europe. Yet even in the depths of this devastation, there were subtle shifts in society that began to shape the future of the world. Those who survived, whether they wanted to or not, found themselves at the heart of a world in recovery, a world that was learning to rebuild, albeit one painful piece at a time. The first thing you'd notice about the post-plague world is the overwhelming emptiness. It's as though the disease had hollowed out not just the bodies of the dead, but the very cities themselves. People once packed tightly into towns and villages now found themselves spread out across vast landscapes. The streets were quieter, with fewer voices, fewer carts rolling by, and fewer feet walking the cobblestone roads. In some ways, it was a kind of silence that carried a weight of sorrow. Those who remained didn't know where to start rebuilding. And yet, as the months turned into years, the survivors did start to rebuild. The The population had thinned so drastically that there was in some ways more land to go around. Fields that had once been overworked by laborers now had a chance to recover. The scarcity of people meant there was more land for those who remained, and the prices for labor went up. But the labor wasn't easy. Fields still needed to be plowed, homes still needed to be repaired, and businesses, what few remained, needed to be reopened. For many survivors, this meant a shift in perspective. No longer were they just laborers tied to a system of feudalism that had dominated Europe for centuries. The loss of so many people led to an unprecedented shift in power dynamics. With so few workers, those who remained in the workforce had newfound bargaining power. The labor shortages made landowners and nobles increasingly dependent on peasants and workers who began demanding higher wages and better conditions. Over time, this shift in power led to a subtle but undeniable breakdown of the feudal system that had long held Europe in its grip. Workers were able to leave oppressive, low-paying jobs in search of better opportunities. The very structure of society began to change slowly, eroding the rigid hierarchy that had been in place for centuries. At the same time, the economic structure of Europe was undergoing a transformation. In some regions, agriculture slowly began to recover, with farmers finding themselves able to negotiate better terms. In other regions, however, entire industries were wiped out by the plague, leaving survivors struggling to adapt. What had once been a thriving medieval economy now looked much different. Cities that had once been centers of trade and culture became places of rubble and ruin. Major trade routes had to be reestablished, and it took years for the supply chains to get back to what they had been before. However, the psychological impact on society was perhaps the most profound. People had seen so much death, and many had lost everything. The concept of what it meant to be alive had changed. Every survivor knew that they had somehow cheated death, but they also carried the heavy burden of witnessing the collapse of the world they had once known. And while there were many survivors who found strength in this new reality, learning to adjust to a changed world, there were just as many who were broken by it. The scars of the Black Plague ran deep, and the mental toll it took on people wasn't something that could be easily quantified. People who survived the plague were often deeply affected by what they had witnessed. They had seen entire families wiped out, in days entire neighborhoods turned to ghost towns. The psychological impact wasn't just on those who had contracted the disease, but also on the people who had to witness the suffering of their loved ones. The plague caused a kind of trauma that would take generations to process, if at all. This trauma was not just an individual experience. It was a collective experience. Communities once tightly knit were now fractured. Survivors struggled to rebuild their lives in a world where nothing seemed safe anymore. It wasn't just the loss of loved ones, it was the loss of security, of trust in the systems that had once held society together. People became more cautious, more suspicious, and in some cases, even more isolated. The communal bonds that had once defined many medieval villages were now replaced with a sense of solitude that permeated everyday life. And then there was the long-term demographic impact. The plague had wiped out entire generations of people, leaving Europe with a demographic hole that would take decades, if not centuries, to fill. For many regions, it meant a decline in population for years to come. The sheer scale of the death toll also meant that entire families were gone, and without the younger generations to take their place, many parts of Europe faced a slow, painful decline in population. As time went on, the survivors of the Black Plague began to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. But the world they had known had irrevocably changed. Those who had lived through the plague had seen the worst humanity could face, and they were left with a world that was physically and emotionally scarred. The recovery would take time, and in some places it would take centuries, but the seeds of change were already being planted. The societal shifts that began in the wake of the plague were only the beginning of a long transformation. The Black Plague had weakened the feudal system, but it had also shown that society was capable of change. It may have been an era defined by death and destruction, but it was also the beginning of a new era in which the old social structures gave way to new, more fluid systems. Survivors who had once been tied to the land were now able to move more freely, seek better wages, and begin to carve out a new place for themselves in a society that had been fundamentally altered. And as Europe began to recover, the plague's legacy lived on, not just in the survivors who bore the scars of their experiences, but in the very fabric of society. It had changed everything, from the way people viewed death to the way they lived their lives. It had taught people to adapt to survive, and perhaps most importantly, to rebuild a world that had seemed beyond repair. As we continue to reflect on the aftermath of the Black Plague, it's impossible to ignore the enormous strain it placed on medical knowledge and the practice of healing. The 14th century was a time of limited understanding of disease, but the Black Plague pushed the boundaries of ignorance and desperation to new extremes. People were suffering, and they didn't know why, much less how to fix it. Medical practitioners of the time were largely powerless to stop the disease, and their treatments, while well-meaning, were often both bizarre and utterly ineffective. Imagine for a moment that you are living through the plague, and you're lucky enough to have access to a physician. Though lucky might be the wrong word, the medical knowledge of the time was rudimentary, to say the least. Doctors had no concept of bacteria or viruses. In fact, they had no real understanding of germs at all. Instead, many relied on ancient theories from the Greeks and Romans, such as the idea of the four humors. According to this belief, illness was caused by an imbalance in the body's four basic fluids: blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. So, when faced with the plague, many doctors thought the disease was the result of an imbalance of these humors, not an external pathogen. To treat it, they often prescribed bleeding purging and other painful procedures that in hindsight likely made things worse. One of the most common treatments at the time was bloodletting. This process involved draining a patient's blood to restore balance to their humors, which doctors believed would help their body fight off disease. In theory, it wasn't completely outlandish after all. There was some truth to the idea that the body needed to expel toxins. But when it came to a disease as virulent as the Black Plague, bloodletting didn't stand a chance. In fact, removing blood from a weakened body often weakened it even further, hastening death instead of curing it. Then there were the more creative treatments. For example, many physicians tried to use herbs, incense, and perfumes to ward off the plague. The belief that the disease was caused by bad air miasma meant that people thought foul-smelling air could carry illness. As a result, many doctors encouraged their patients to carry sweet-smelling flowers or herbs like lavender rose petals and cloves to ward off the noxious fumes they believed were to blame for the illness. Some even carried special plague masks designed with long beak-like noses that were filled with aromatic herbs to keep the bad air at bay. While these masks might have looked amusing to modern eyes, they were born out of fear and desperation, hoping that the sweet smell of herbs could somehow counteract the lethal effects of the disease. But perhaps the most bizarre remedy of all was the use of plague stones. These were large stones that people believed could absorb the disease, and they were often placed under beds or carried by patients in an effort to absorb the illness. The idea was that the stone would draw the plague out of the body. Some people even went so far as to wear them around their necks, like amulets, hoping for protection from the disease. Of course, these stones did absolutely nothing to help, but they provided comfort, however misguided, in a time when comfort was hard to find. For those unlucky enough to contract the disease, the chances of survival were slim, but there were still a few who managed to live through it. What's fascinating about these survivors is that while their survival was often a matter of sheer luck, some doctors and healers began to notice that certain individuals were more likely to survive than others. The question of why some people seemed more resistant to the plague remains a topic of scientific debate even today. Some have suggested that genetic factors played a role. In fact, scientists now believe that certain genetic mutations, such as a mutation in the CCR5 gene, which is also associated with resistance to HIV, may have provided some level of protection against the Black Plague. If you were lucky enough to have inherited this gene, you might have had a better chance of surviving, though. At the time, people had no idea why some were immune while others weren't. Even without the knowledge of genetics, there were a few medical practices that actually helped in small ways. For instance, doctors eventually began to realize that isolation could help limit the spread of the disease. Those who were infected were often quarantined, as discussed earlier. But this wasn't a universal practice, and it took a while for it to catch on. The idea that separating the sick from the healthy might help stem the tide of the plague was one of the earliest forms of public health policy in Europe, even if it was implemented more out of fear than scientific reasoning. In addition to quarantine measures, people began to recognize that hygiene, while still rudimentary by modern standards, could help reduce the spread of disease. Cleaning homes and clothes, avoiding contact with the sick, and using rudimentary disinfectants like vinegar and alcohol became common practices. Of course, they didn't have the sophisticated tools and knowledge we have today, but these primitive steps were some of the first inklings of the idea that cleanliness could be an essential part of preventing the spread of disease. But the truth is, most of what people did in the 14th century to combat the plague was either ineffective or downright harmful. It wasn't until centuries later that modern medicine, with its understanding of germs, bacteria, and viruses, would begin to understand what made diseases like the plague so deadly. But for the survivors of the Black Plague, their experience wasn't just about physical healing. It was about enduring the psychological trauma of seeing so many fall to the disease and coping with the fear and uncertainty that came with living in a world where death was constant and inevitable. The Black Plague shattered medical knowledge, but in doing so, it laid the groundwork for the eventual development of more effective public health strategies and the birth of modern medicine. In many ways, the plague marked the beginning of a new era in which science and medicine would slowly but surely begin to replace superstition and guesswork. The experience of those who survived the Black Plague and the physicians who tried and often failed to cure it was a vital step on the road to understanding disease in the centuries to come. As the survivors of the Black Plague navigated their way through a changed world, they found that the very social fabric of their societies had been altered in ways that would have seemed unimaginable just a few years earlier. The impact of the plague extended far beyond just the loss of life. It reshaped social structures, economic systems, and the way people related to one another in fundamental ways. The Black Plague didn't just ravage bodies. It also shattered the old hierarchies that had governed medieval Europe for centuries. One of the most profound shifts was in the structure of the labor market. Before the plague, Europe was a largely agrarian society, and the feudal system had dictated that peasants worked the land for landowners in exchange for protection and a place to live. It was a rigid, hierarchical system in which the vast majority of people were bound by birth to serve the landowners. The plague, with its massive death toll, upended that system in dramatic ways. Suddenly, there were fewer workers to tend the fields, harvest the crops, and keep the economy moving. With so many people dead, labor became a precious commodity. Those who survived found themselves in a position of unprecedented power. Peasants and laborers, once bound to a life of servitude, now had the opportunity to negotiate better wages and better working conditions. In some regions, workers began demanding higher pay, and landlords, desperate to get their crops harvested, had little choice but to agree. For the first time in centuries, the power dynamics between workers and landowners shifted in favor of the workers. This shift was particularly evident in rural areas. As the population dropped and labor became scarce, many peasants found themselves able to negotiate land leases that gave them greater autonomy. In some cases, peasants began to buy their own land, while others moved to cities in search of better opportunities. This migration from rural areas to urban centers contributed to the rise of towns and cities, which had been largely stagnant before the plague. The labor shortage meant that workers were no longer confined to the rigid social roles that had previously governed their lives. It was the beginning of a slow but irreversible change in the way people lived and worked. In urban areas, the story was much the same. Cities which had once been bustling trade hubs were now ghost towns filled with empty homes and abandoned businesses. The lack of people to work meant that some industries went into decline, but it also opened up new possibilities. The labor shortage led to a rise in wages, and with fewer workers available, some artisans and craftsmen began to experiment with new techniques and innovations. In the wake of the plague, cities began to slowly rebuild, and this new economic flexibility led to the growth of a middle class. Those who were neither noble nor peasant, but could live off their skills and trades. The Black Plague's impact on the labor market wasn't just an economic phenomenon. It was also a social one. The idea that anyone regardless of birth could rise up through hard work and skill was revolutionary. While the rigid class system didn't disappear overnight, the social mobility that emerged in the wake of the plague would lay the groundwork for the dramatic shifts in European society that would come in the centuries that followed. What had once been a society strictly divided between nobility clergy and peasants was now beginning to fracture. More and more people were beginning to think of themselves not as cogs in a feudal system, but as individuals with power to shape their own destinies. But the social changes weren't limited to just labor and class. The plague had a profound effect on the way people viewed authority and governance. Before the plague, the church and monarchy held nearly unquestioned power. The church in particular had been a pillar of authority in every aspect of life, from moral teachings to health advice. But after the plague, many people began to question the power of the church. The church's failure to protect people from the plague, despite its promises of divine intervention, caused many to lose faith. People had prayed, they had fasted, and yet the plague still swept through their cities and towns. For some, this was a turning point, a realization that perhaps earthly authority had limits and that there was more to life than blind faith in the divine. This loss of trust in the church set the stage for the religious upheavals that would follow in the coming centuries. The Protestant Reformation, which would take place in the 16th century, was partly fueled by the disillusionment that emerged after the plague. The plague had shown that the church, despite its power, was not immune to the forces of nature, and that its authority could be questioned. This would have a lasting impact on European society as religious and political systems began to fragment and evolve. In addition to challenging religious authority, the Black Plague also had profound effects on politics and governance. With the death of so many people, including key leaders, kingdoms and empires found themselves weakened. Monarchies already struggling to maintain control were now forced to adapt to a rapidly changing world. In many places, political instability increased as the balance of power shifted between rulers and the people. Kings and nobles, who once held absolute power, were now more dependent on the loyalty of their subjects as people began to realize their own power in the new social order. This newfound awareness of personal autonomy wasn't limited to labor and governance. It also extended to culture. In the wake of the plague, art, literature, and philosophy took on new dimensions. Many artists began to explore themes of death, suffering, and the fragility of life in ways they hadn't before. The Black Plague forced people to confront the impermanence of life, and this was reflected in the art and literature of the time. Works like the Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, which tells the story of a group of people escaping the plague, and the Dance of Death paintings that began to appear in churches, captured the collective consciousness of a society that had been forced to face its mortality. In fact, the Black Plague may have indirectly sparked the beginnings of the Renaissance. The period of intellectual and artistic growth that followed the plague was fueled by a desire to understand life and death, to question the authority of the church, and to explore new ways of thinking about the world. The devastation of the plague pushed people to look inward to seek answers and to challenge the old ways of thinking. In this sense, the plague was not just a time of death, it was also a time of rebirth, a time when the old ways of doing things gave way to new ideas, new art, and a new way of looking at the world. After the Black Plague, it wasn't just the people who had been affected by disease and death who felt its influence. The very fabric of European culture had been transformed. The shift was visible not only in the economic and social structures, but also in the arts. Art, literature, and music, things that had once been a reflection of life, were now increasingly fixated on death. The Black Plague, by its nature, forced people to confront mortality in a way they hadn't before. It stripped away the illusion of immortality that many had held, leaving artists and thinkers to explore death, life, and the meaning of both in a new and often morbid light. One of the most noticeable cultural shifts in the wake of the plague was the way death became an ever-present subject in art. In the medieval period, death was often seen through the lens of religious symbolism. But the aftermath of the plague took a more personal, raw approach to the subject. The danse macabre, or dance of death, emerged as a popular motif during this time. These images depicted death personified dancing with people from all walks of life. Kings, peasants, rich and poor alike. The message was clear: no one was safe. Death did not discriminate. These works were a reminder of the fragile nature of life and the inevitability of death themes that had been brought into sharper focus by the plague. The danse macabre wasn't the only way the plague influenced art. Many works from this period began to depict the physical realities of death-decaying corpses. The sick and dying were painted or sculpted in a way that was far more detailed and visceral than previous depictions. Artists sought to capture the rawness of mortality, forcing viewers to confront the decay that had become so common during the plague years. Some artists even painted scenes of mass graves where bodies were piled high as a direct response to the widespread death. This was art that didn't just acknowledge death, but embraced it, showing it in a way that had never been done before. Literature, too, reflected the cultural shift brought on by the Black Plague. Writers began to focus on themes of lost survival and the uncertainty of life. One of the most famous literary works to emerge from the aftermath of the plague was Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron. The work is set against the backdrop of the Black Plague, with a group of people fleeing the infected city of Florence to escape the disease. While hiding away in a country villa, they tell stories to pass the time. The stories themselves range from humorous to tragic, reflecting the diverse ways people sought comfort and distraction in the face of the epidemic. But the plague serves as a constant reminder in Boccaccio's narrative, a shadow that looms over everything. His work captured not just the devastation of the disease, but also the strange resilience of humanity in the face of overwhelming disaster. Meanwhile, in other parts of Europe, the Black Plague led to the emergence of a new type of literature, the miracle plays and morality plays. These types of theater were often centered around themes of life and death, salvation and damnation, reflecting the fears and questions people had about what had just transpired. The rise of memento mori, reminders of death, became prevalent, with literature encouraging people to reflect on the brevity of life and the certainty of death. In music, too, there was a distinct shift. Before the Black Plague, much of the music in Europe was focused on religious themes, hymns, chants, and masses. After the plague, however, the sense of divine certainty seemed to wane for many. Composers began to explore more secular themes and the idea of human life. The struggles, joys, and sorrows of individual existence became a more prominent subject. The loss of so many lives and the questioning of established truths led to new forms of expression in music as composers sought to communicate the emotional landscape of a world that had experienced such deep loss. Perhaps most importantly, the cultural transformation that followed the Black Plague laid the groundwork for the Renaissance. The upheaval caused by the plague had shifted people's worldview, and many began to seek answers outside of traditional religious teachings. The uncertainty, coupled with the desire for a new beginning, created fertile ground for the ideas of the Renaissance to take root. Artists and scholars looked back to the classical world for inspiration, focusing on humanism, the belief in the value of human experience, creativity, and intellect. The focus shifted away from purely religious themes to the exploration of the individual, the natural world, and the intellectual capacity of humanity. In a way, the Black Plague's devastation forced people to start rethinking their relationship with life, death, and everything in between. The cultural products of this period, whether they were paintings, stories, or music, were a direct response to the trauma and transformation people had experienced. It was a time when life and death were no longer abstract concepts or distant ideas, but were felt deeply in the bones of everyday existence. And while the plague itself was a time of despair and fear, it also set the stage for a cultural awakening that would change the course of history. The Black Plague pushed humanity to confront its mortality in ways it hadn't before. But in doing so, it sparked an era of creativity, exploration, and a search for meaning that would eventually give rise to the artistic and intellectual revolution of the Renaissance. It was a period defined by the tension between life and death, a tension that became a central theme in the art, literature, and music of the time. And while the plague may have been an overwhelming force of destruction, it also became the catalyst for the rebirth of European culture as people found new ways to express their understanding of the world around them. The Black Plague didn't just leave its mark on art, literature, and social structures. It also left an indelible impression on how the disease spread across the globe. From its origins in Asia to its catastrophic journey through Europe, the plague's path was one of incredible devastation and mystery. Yet despite the widespread destruction it caused, the exact ways the disease spread, and the full scope of its journey remain a subject of fascination and debate among historians and scientists. To fully understand the plague's spread, it's essential to look at how it began. The origins of the Black Plague are believed to trace back to the steppes of Central Asia, specifically to the region around the Mongolian Empire. The bacteria responsible for the disease, Yersinia pestis, likely began circulating among local rodent populations where it was carried by fleas. These fleas would bite an infected rodent and then bite humans, transmitting the bacteria. While the exact sequence of events remains unclear, it is thought that the plague began in China, with outbreaks occurring intermittently in the region, long before it ever reached Europe. The movement of armies, merchants, and travelers across vast distances provided the perfect conditions for the disease to spread. The Mongol Empire, which stretched from China to Eastern Europe, played a pivotal role in facilitating the plague's spread across Asia and Europe. The Mongols were highly mobile, and their vast empire created a network of trade routes that connected disparate parts of the world, including the famous Silk Road. This made it easier for goods and people to move quickly across long distances, but it also allowed the disease to travel with them. As the Mongols moved westward, the plague followed in their wake. It's believed that the first outbreak in Europe occurred around 1347, when a Mongol siege of the Crimean city of Kaffa, modern-day Feodosia in Ukraine, may have been the site of the initial transmission. The story goes that the Mongols, who had already been suffering from the plague, catapulted the bodies of their dead soldiers over the walls of the city, infecting the defenders. It's said that some of the defenders then fled the city, carrying the disease with them as they sailed to Italy. Once the plague reached Europe, it spread rapidly. The densely packed cities and towns provided the perfect environment for the disease to thrive, exacerbated by unsanitary conditions, overcrowding, and the movement of people between cities and countries. From Italy, the disease spread quickly across Europe, reaching France, Spain, and England within a matter of months. The sheer speed with which it spread was nothing short of astonishing. Within just a few years, the disease had wiped out an estimated 25 to 30 million people, or roughly a third of Europe's population. The plague didn't stop there. It continued its devastating journey to other parts of the world. From Europe, it spread to North Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, reaching as far as India. By the time the epidemic had run its course, it had affected virtually every continent, leaving a trail of death and destruction in its wake. The global nature of the plague's spread is a testament to the interconnectedness of the medieval world, even though many, at the time, would not have realized how deeply tied their fates were to far-off regions. But the spread of the plague wasn't just a product of human movement. Scientists still argue whether climate and environmental factors also played a significant role in the epidemic's reach. Some scholars suggest that climate changes in the years leading up to the outbreak, such as a cooler, wetter period known as the Little Ice Age, may have created more favorable conditions for the fleas and rats that carried the disease. The colder temperatures and increased rainfall likely encouraged larger populations of rodents, which in turn made it easier for the plague to spread. Other scholars have pointed to changes in the population dynamics of both humans and animals, which may have set the stage for the disease to make its leap to humans in such a deadly form. The fact that the plague spread so quickly and with such devastating consequences raises many questions about how medieval societies understood the nature of disease and how they responded to it. As we've already seen, many medieval people believed that the disease was sent by God as a punishment for sins. This belief led to widespread panic, with people turning to extreme religious practices like flagellation, hoping to appease a vengeful God. Others, as mentioned earlier, blamed Jews, who were scapegoated and often attacked or expelled from towns and cities during outbreaks. These responses were often based on fear, superstition, and a lack of understanding of the disease's true causes. The spread of the plague also had profound effects on the development of early public health measures. Though the concept of quarantine was in its infancy, it became one of the earliest responses to limit the spread of disease. Ports began to isolate ships arriving from infected regions, and cities began to establish plague houses where the sick could be isolated from the healthy. However, these measures were largely ineffective in stopping the disease. Without a true understanding of the bacterium responsible for the plague, people could only rely on crude methods like isolating the infected or burning clothing and belongings. The concept of contagion was still not well understood, and the methods used to control the disease often did little to stem its spread. Despite the ignorance surrounding the true nature of the disease, some modern scholars argue that the plague acted as a sort of wake-up call for societies in Europe and Asia. The devastation wrought by the plague led to the development of better public health practices in the years that followed. Though the immediate aftermath was marked by fear and confusion, the experience of dealing with the Black Plague eventually spurred efforts to improve sanitation, establish quarantine procedures, and develop more structured responses to pandemics. In many ways, the plague laid the groundwork for the eventual development of modern public health systems, even if the knowledge to do so was still centuries away. So, as we look back on the Black Plague's global journey, it's clear that its impact wasn't limited to Europe. The disease spread across continents, reshaping societies, economies, and the very nature of life itself. It's easy to focus on the devastation, but it's important to also acknowledge how the plague spurred scientific inquiry, public health measures, and a greater awareness of how interconnected the world had become. The Black Plague may have been a tragedy of unimaginable scale, but its lessons have shaped the way we think about disease society and human resilience today. The psychological toll of the Black Plague on survivors was as profound as its physical destruction. Surviving the plague wasn't just about battling the disease itself. It was also about grappling with the immense mental and emotional scars left by such an overwhelming catastrophe. In a world where death seemed omnipresent, those who made it through found themselves living in a reality that had been altered in ways they could scarcely comprehend. Imagine for a moment that you've lived through the plague. You were fortunate enough to survive, but now you face the aftermath. The world you once knew is gone, and you've been left to pick up the pieces. Your family, your friends gone. Cities lie in ruin with vacant houses and empty marketplaces. The places where you once found solace now seem eerily deserted, and the constant reminders of the dead haunt your every step. Even if you were lucky enough to escape the disease, you now carry the weight of what you've seen: the bodies, the suffering, the endless march of death that took away so many of those you loved. For many survivors, the emotional impact of the plague was just as difficult to endure as the physical toll. The trauma of watching entire families, villages, and even entire cities disappear in a matter of weeks created a deep sense of grief and loss that didn't go away once the disease had passed. It wasn't just the loss of loved ones that haunted survivors. It was the pervasive feeling of uncertainty and the constant reminder that life was fragile. Every day became a reminder of how quickly everything could be taken away. The sheer randomness of who lived and who died made survival itself feel like a cruel lottery. Some survivors were left with a profound sense of guilt. Why had they been spared while others, people who were just as worthy, just as beloved, hadn't? This sense of survivor's guilt was common, and it wasn't something that could be easily shaken off. Imagine the haunting thought that you had been lucky, yes, but only in the cruelest way. You lived, but everyone else you cared about perished. And now, you're left to navigate a world that's forever changed. And then there were the feelings of fear and anxiety. Even after the immediate threat of the plague had subsided, the fear of a recurrence never truly left. For years, the specter of another outbreak loomed large in the minds of the survivors. Every cough, every fever, was a potential sign that the plague had returned, and with it, death. people became hyper-aware of their health, constantly fearful that they too would succumb to the disease. This constant anxiety about whether the plague would strike again shaped the way people lived and interacted for years, even decades after the worst of the epidemic had passed. On a more societal level, the survivors faced a world that had been irrevocably changed. With so many people dead, survivors were left to rebuild their communities and societies from the ground up. This wasn't just a matter of rebuilding houses or businesses, it was about rebuilding the very idea of community. The social bonds that had once held people together were now fragile and strained. Trust in one another had been eroded by the plague as families were torn apart and neighbors turned against one another in fear. In some ways, the plague created a society that was more individualistic and less communal. People were less likely to rely on one another out of fear that anyone could be carrying the disease. Survivors also had to cope with the long-term effects of the trauma they had experienced. The plague had stripped away the illusion of safety and security. People who had once lived in relative peace and stability now found themselves in a world defined by uncertainty. Even if they survived the disease, they couldn't escape the mental and emotional toll it had taken. The death of so many people in such a short period of time was an experience that left many survivors with a deep sense of disillusionment. It wasn't just the trauma of witnessing so much suffering. It was the realization that life was much more fragile than they had ever imagined. In a way, surviving the Black Plague was an experience that forever altered the way people thought about the world and their place in it. It forced them to confront the reality of death in a way that most people had never experienced before. And while many survivors were able to rebuild their lives, they did so with the knowledge that life could be taken away at any moment. The plague had introduced an element of existential uncertainty into people's lives, and it was a burden that many carried for the rest of their lives. In the years that followed, the trauma of the Black Plague would reverberate through generations. Those who lived through it passed down their stories and experiences to their children, shaping the way future generations viewed life, death, and disease. The emotional scars left by the plague were not easily healed, and they became part of the collective memory of society. Over time, the plague would fade into history, but the psychological impact it had on survivors remained. For them, life would never be the same. It wasn't just that they had survived. It was that they had lived through something that had shattered their world and their understanding of what was possible. The trauma of the plague didn't just fade away. It shaped the future in profound ways. The survivors of the Black Plague, whether they recognized it or not, were living in a world where everything had been altered. Their lives were marked not just by the physical scars of disease, but by the deep emotional and psychological toll that surviving such an event had taken. It wasn't just the loss of family members and friends. It was the loss of a world that could never be fully rebuilt. The loss of innocence and the awareness that life could be extinguished in an instant. The mental and emotional impact of surviving the Black Plague was, in many ways, the most enduring legacy of the event. It was an experience that left a lasting mark on society, one that would continue to shape the way people viewed life, death, and everything in between for generations to come. As Europe and the rest of the world began to recover from the horrors of the Black Plague, it was clear that the long-term consequences of the disease would go far beyond the immediate devastation. In the years and decades that followed, the plague's after effects were felt in every corner of society, from shifts in demographics and economics to the development of early public health systems and the rise of new cultural movements. The plague had opened a window into a new world, one where survival meant more than just physical endurance. It also meant adapting to a society fundamentally transformed by the catastrophic event. One of the most notable long-term effects of the plague was the massive demographic shift it caused. With an estimated third of Europe's population wiped out, the very structure of European society was upended. Towns and villages, which had once been bustling hubs of activity, were suddenly ghost towns with empty houses and fields left untended. Whole generations of children, families, and communities were lost. The loss of so many lives led to labor shortages, as there simply weren't enough people left to work. The land tend to livestock or staff the businesses that once kept cities running. In rural areas, this labor shortage had a profound effect. With fewer workers available, peasants and laborers found themselves in a stronger bargaining position than ever before. The feudal system, which had long bound the lower classes to the land, began to lose its grip. As landowners struggled to fill vacant positions, many peasants were able to demand higher wages and better working conditions. Some even left their rural lives behind to seek out better opportunities in the cities. The result was a slow but steady erosion of the traditional social order, which had been based on rigid class distinctions. For many survivors, the plague marked the beginning of a new era of relative mobility. In cities, this demographic shift was equally significant. The labor shortage that gripped the countryside also affected urban areas where business owners faced difficulty finding workers. Wages rose as a result, giving workers more disposable income and increasing their purchasing power. In some cases, this newfound wealth allowed workers to accumulate property or secure more favorable living conditions. As trade and commerce began to recover, new opportunities opened up for artisans, merchants, and craftsmen. What had once been a world where the vast majority of people lived in poverty now saw the emergence of a middle class, an unprecedented development in medieval Europe. But the economic consequences of the Black Plague weren't all positive. The sudden loss of such a large portion of the population also led to economic instability. Entire industries, such as textile production, agriculture, and manufacturing, were devastated, as there were simply not enough workers to keep these industries running at full capacity. This led to price inflation as food and goods became scarce, and the demand for labor skyrocketed. In some regions, the plague also caused disruptions in trade, as the destruction of urban centers and the breakdown of transportation networks made it more difficult to move goods across Europe. These economic disruptions contributed to a prolonged period of instability that persisted long after the disease had subsided. At the same time, the Black Plague also spurred the development of early public health systems, as governments and local authorities began to recognize the need for better management of disease outbreaks. While many of the measures taken at the time were based more on fear and superstition than on scientific understanding, they laid the groundwork for more effective public health practices in the centuries to come. One of the first public health measures implemented during the plague was quarantine. While the concept of quarantine was far from perfect, it marked a significant step in the evolution of public health systems. In many European cities, infected individuals were isolated from the rest of the population, often in designated plague houses or on ships docked outside the harbor. In some cases, entire neighborhoods or districts were quarantined with guards preventing people from leaving or entering. While these measures were imperfect and often ineffectively enforced, they represented an early attempt to limit the spread of disease through isolation and containment. In addition to quarantine, some cities also began to develop rudimentary sanitation systems. Public health officials recognized that the filthy conditions in many medieval cities contributed to the spread of disease. Though they didn't have the knowledge to link disease directly to poor hygiene, the fact that people began cleaning their homes, burning contaminated clothing, and trying to dispose of waste more carefully was a significant shift from earlier practices. These early attempts at sanitation were the first steps toward modern public health infrastructure, though they would take many more centuries to fully develop. Another major outcome of the plague was the shift in religious and philosophical thought. As we've seen, many people at the time saw the plague as a punishment from God, and this belief led to widespread religious fervor, with some groups even going so far as to flagellate themselves in hopes of appeasing God's wrath. However, in the aftermath of the plague, the disillusionment with religion grew. People began to question the authority of the church, which had failed to prevent or explain the disease. The idea that the church could not save them from the suffering they had endured led many to seek new answers that didn't come from the old authorities. This questioning of authority set the stage for the intellectual and cultural movements that would define the Renaissance. As people turned away from religious explanations for the plague, they began to look to the classical works of Greece and Rome for inspiration. The Renaissance, which began in Italy in the late 14th century, marked a cultural rebirth that was heavily influenced by the ideas of humanism. This intellectual movement placed an emphasis on the individual, the potential for human achievement, and the importance of education and knowledge. In many ways, the Renaissance was a direct response to the trauma and disillusionment caused by the plague. The desire to rebuild and rediscover human creativity, innovation, and possibility became a driving force for a new generation of artists, scholars, and thinkers. The impact of the Black Plague was not only felt in Europe, but also in Asia and the Middle East. As the disease spread along trade routes, it wreaked havoc in regions that had once been thriving centers of commerce and culture. In China, where the plague is believed to have originated, entire communities were wiped out, and the social and economic systems that had sustained the vast empire were severely disrupted. In the Middle East, the plague also led to a sharp decline in population, which contributed to a period of political instability and economic decline. The Black Plague's devastating effects were global, and while Europe would eventually recover, the rest of the world continued to feel the repercussions for many years to come. The long-term recovery from the Black Plague wasn't just about rebuilding societies and economies. It was about rebuilding trust. Trust in governments, in religious institutions, and in one another had been shattered by the disease. Survivors had to learn to live in a world where death could strike at any moment, and where the certainty of the past had been replaced by an uncertain future. It was a time of resilience, but also of deep psychological scars. as people faced the reality that they had survived something far beyond their understanding. The Black Plague didn't just change the course of history, it reshaped the very fabric of society, culture, and human experience. The survivors may have rebuilt their homes and their businesses, but the emotional, social, and cultural impacts of the disease would reverberate for centuries to come. It was a turning point not only in the history of Europe, but in the history of human civilization itself. As we reflect on the legacy of the Black Plague, it's impossible to ignore how the event continues to shape our understanding of pandemics and public health today. Though centuries have passed since the plague ravaged Europe, the lessons it taught us remain ever relevant. The plague's impact on society, its widespread devastation, its influence on culture and economy, and its effects on medical science paved the way for the modern world's approach to disease health and human resilience. In many ways, the Black Plague acted as a precursor to the pandemics that would follow in history, shaping not only how we respond to disease, but also how we think about life, death, and the societal structures that hold us together. The uncertainty and fear that accompanied the plague, the complete breakdown of normal life, and the overwhelming feeling of helplessness are experiences that resonate with us today when faced with global health crises. It's a reminder that despite the advances we've made in science and technology, we are still vulnerable to forces beyond our control. However, the way we now approach these threats has been significantly influenced by the responses to the Black Plague. One of the most profound legacies of the plague is the development of public health practices that continue to guide us today. The rudimentary quarantines and sanitary measures established in the wake of the plague were early attempts to control the spread of infectious disease. And though they were far from perfect, they laid the foundation for the modern systems of disease control we rely on today. Quarantine itself, a term that arose from the practice of isolating people for 40 days to prevent the spread of the disease, has become one of the primary tools for containing pandemics. The idea of isolating the sick, controlling movement, and attempting to limit exposure to disease is still central to our modern response to outbreaks. But even more than just quarantine, the Black Plague highlighted the importance of medical innovation. The failure of medieval doctors to understand the plague and offer effective treatments underscored the need for advancements in medical science. The period following the Black Plague saw the first stirrings of what would eventually become modern epidemiology, the study of how diseases spread and how to control them. Though the science of the time was limited, it set the stage for future generations of doctors and scientists who would make breakthroughs in understanding pathogens, disease transmission, and vaccination. The plague also revealed how fragile social systems can be in the face of widespread death. The breakdown of the feudal system, the upheaval in cities, and the labor shortages that followed had profound effects on the structure of society. The consequences of the plague would eventually lead to the rise of early capitalism as wages rose and the labor became more valued. But it was also a period of growing social unrest. The plague left a scar on the collective consciousness of Europe as survivors found themselves living in a world where the old certainties no longer held. What the Black Plague taught the world is that societies are interconnected, and when one part of the system falters, the entire structure can be at risk. From a cultural perspective, the Black Plague changed how humanity viewed life and death. The sheer scale of death and destruction was a shock to the medieval worldview, where the church and religion had often offered the comfort of divine control over life and death. The devastation of the plague, however, undermined that belief for many people. Survivors were left to grapple with a world where their faith no longer seemed to protect them from suffering. This questioning of religious authority eventually gave rise to new philosophical movements such as humanism and laid the groundwork for the Renaissance. It wasn't just a shift in art or science. It was a deep-seated transformation in how people thought about their place in the world. As we consider the impact of the Black Plague on our modern world, it's crucial to remember that this was not a singular event. It was part of a larger continuum of pandemics and disease outbreaks that have shaped human history. From the Spanish flu of 1918 to the ongoing challenges posed by diseases like HIV/AIDS, SARS, and COVID-19, pandemics are a recurring part of our existence. And just as the Black Plague forced people to adapt, evolve, and rethink their understanding of health, so too does each new pandemic challenge us to reconsider how we approach public health, how we care for the vulnerable, and how we find hope in the darkest times. There is also a certain resilience inherent in humanity's response to such widespread suffering. Despite the devastation of the Black Plague society, rebuilt economies recovered and cultures flourished in the centuries that followed. The Renaissance, for instance, was a direct result of the changes that occurred in the wake of the plague. The shift in how people viewed themselves, emphasizing individual potential and the human capacity for creativity, transformed the intellectual and artistic landscape of Europe. The lessons learned from surviving a global catastrophe, in a sense, set the stage for the cultural and scientific advancements that would follow. So, while the Black Plague was a tragedy of unprecedented scale, it was also a catalyst for change. It reshaped not only the landscape of Europe, but also the very way we think about life, death, and survival. The psychological toll of the plague, the questioning of authority, and the emergence of new social and economic structures all played a role in shaping the modern world. As we live through our own public health crises, today, the story of the Black Plague offers us valuable lessons in survival resilience and adaptation. It reminds us that while we may face hardships and suffering, humanity has always found a way to rebuild. The world after the plague was one of profound change, but it was also one of hope renewal and the realization that we are capable of surviving even the most catastrophic events. As we reflect on these events, we are reminded that history is never just about the past. It's about the ongoing journey of human experience. The Black Plague, though centuries behind us, continues to shape our understanding of health, society, and our shared capacity for resilience.